The Holy Gospel is written in the 16th chapter of the Gospel according to St. Matthew, beginning to read at the 13th verse. Glory to you, Lord Jesus Christ. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. For the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, I have to confess I struggled a little bit with today's sermon. In fact, perhaps scaringly, I had a dream, I think it was Wednesday night, that was in fact Saturday night, so right now, and I hadn't prepared. So I was going to come to church and just add the entire sermon. I don't know if that's a dream or a nightmare, for me or for you. But I have prepared it. I have, in fact, been thinking about the sermon for the past month or so. And it's a bit of a mixture because I think tonight's readings are very valuable readings, but sort of fit together in I've tried to fit them together in a funny sort of way, so I hope you'll find this a bit helpful. First, I want to talk about the first part of the Romans reading. In that part of the reading, Paul exalts all Christians to present themselves as a living sacrifice. We use the expression fairly often. I've noticed since we've gone into COVID, we've tended to use the other prayer after communion. But it's worth thinking about what being a living sacrifice is. I remember talking about this in my confirmation classes many years ago with Father Douglas Brown. I remember him saying that, well, of course, you're all going to die one day and you'll be a sacrifice in that sense, but this is not what it's all about. Being a living sacrifice is giving our time and abilities for the service of God. Being a sacrifice, being constantly giving our time and abilities is much harder than simply making sacrifices. And as part of being a living sacrifice, we need to live each day and offering all that we have, our time and our talents. That's quite hard, but that's what God calls us to do, Paul reminds us. The readings give us a clue on how we can do it. Paul tells us we need to have our minds renewed so we can discern God's will. I guess that's something that's a lot easier said than done. And I often complain that why doesn't God give us written instructions? It would be so much easier. But that's not how it works. It seems to me that having our minds renewed by God is as much as anything a matter of spending time with him. In this modern world where we all get so busy and there's so many distractions, it is harder and harder to find time to be still and spend time in prayer. To spend time in Bible study and meditation. One of the good things about having the daily prayer sent to us is it gives us a bit of a clue, a bit of a time to take some time out and spend some time with the daily prayers and with our own prayer life. So, as I said, I get a bit confused. I now want to look at the gospel. Now, there's a bit of geographical background. You'll recall last week that Jesus was talking to a Canaanite woman. He still hasn't come back into Israel. He's in the place called Caesarea Philippi, which I'm told is a Gentile town. It appears that Jesus was spending some time outside Israel, probably to prepare the disciples for his coming into Jerusalem and all that would bring. I guess he hoped, and it wasn't necessarily successful, there'd be fewer crowds around him outside of Israel. Sorry, printing error. So he starts with a bit of a pop quiz. Who do others say that I am? Perhaps a non-confrontational way to start the conversation, because the disciples don't have to reveal their personal opinions. Jesus gets some very interesting answers. I mean, I can't quite see why the disciples would say John the Baptist. I mean, after all, John the Baptist was dead. His head had ended up on a platter in front of Herod. Ditto with Jeremiah, or one of the old prophets. You could perhaps understand if the disciples said, well, you're one of the new prophets, or a new prophet, or something like that. But they didn't. Perhaps it's easier to understand Elijah. Elijah was one of the great prophets. Some would say the greatest of the prophets. And if you remember the story, I think it's in 2 Kings, he was taken up into heaven in the presence of Elisha. And so the idea of him coming back had been around for a while. And in fact, the book of Malachi talks about Elijah coming back. So perhaps one could understand why the disciples would say, well, maybe you're the reincarnation of Elijah. And I suspect at that point, with a bit of squirming, the disciples were waiting for Jesus to say who he was. But then comes the aha moment. Peter blurts out that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. It was a miraculous insight. And as Jesus himself says, it wasn't Peter's intellect that brought about that insight. Now, last week, you'll recall that Allan preached about Jesus talking to the Canaanite woman, where he had a moment of understanding that his ministry was not just to the Jews, but to all people. It seems to me that Peter had a similar sort of moment here. He finally understood at that point in time that Jesus was more than a prophet, more than just John the Baptist, more than anything else, but he was the long-awaited Messiah. But he wasn't just the Messiah. Messiah literally means the anointed one. And that, of course, is from the ritual where kings and rulers are anointed with oil. And the traditional Jewish idea was that Messiah would be the great military leader who would free Israel once again and restore the kingdom of Israel. But as well as saying that Jesus is the Messiah, he decrees him as the Son of the living God. So he was more than just a great military general or a political leader. He was someone who was to come in and usher in God's kingdom. Well, Peter was clearly open to hearing God. I guess in those days he didn't have the distractions of the internet, and he was living day by day with Jesus. And Jesus was quite open to say to Peter, "For flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven." As Paul explains in our epistle reading, everything we have comes from God. It was not due to Peter's intellect or anything that he did that he understood, but God gave him a special insight. It was that insight and Peter's commitment to carry out his part of the job that enabled him to lead the church after the resurrection. Albeit he had a number of slip-ups, none less, perhaps the most obvious, when he lost sight of Jesus when walking the water and nearly drowned. He also fell away any number of other times. But he stuck to it and was the leader of the early church. Well, I guess I tread on controversy next. The next part of the passage where Jesus says, "And I tell you, You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the powers of Hades will not prevail against it. It is the subject of some controversy. I've done a fair bit of research on that, but I can say if you read 10 articles on it, you get 11 different opinions as to what it means. However, in my research, it appears there are two main strands of thinking about this passage. One, which tends to be the Catholic tradition and why they justify the papacy, is that Jesus is founding the church upon Peter. The more Protestant view is Jesus is building the church on Peter's declaration that he is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And I don't purport to give you an answer. Leave that to people like Allan. But we do know that Peter historically was a leader of the early church, and that he certainly was committed to getting to making the church grow and to establish it, and to keep working on it even in very difficult times during the persecutions of the church. So it does say, I think one can certainly take from the passage that the leaders of the church are given the authority to forgive sins and, in a sense, are the gateway to the kingdom of heaven. I mean, we often look at keys as being the key to open the door, whereas the key may well be showing them the way. If you want to let someone into your house, you can simply give them the keys to let them in. So it may well be that way. So it's clear, whatever way it's looked at, Peter is being commissioned for a leadership task in the early church. And it's a pretty big and an awesome responsibility for the leaders of the church. But that's what Peter was called to do. And some of us will be called to be leaders in the church too. So, the next bit is a bit shocking. Jesus then commands his disciples, don't tell anyone else about it. And one has to wonder why Jesus would do that. In fact, it struck me as a bit of a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy moment. when the people were told that the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe and everything is 42, ignoring the fact they couldn't understand it, they would have wanted to tell everyone. But the disciples were told not to. And we don't really know why, although I suspect it's simply a case that there's a time and a place for everything. And if rumours had got around that Jesus was claiming to be the Messiah, the new King of Israel, then maybe the Jewish authorities wouldn't have even let him into Israel, or would have arrested him on his entry. And that would have meant that his mission, ultimately to the cross, would not have been fulfilled. I don't know. But it's clear that it wasn't too long after that Jesus was proclaimed as the Messiah, albeit a very different Messiah to what the Jewish traditions expect him to be, riding humbly into Jerusalem on a donkey. So, well, going to the second bit of the Romans reading, we need to remind ourselves we're called to be faithful, that we're not all called to be leaders. The body doesn't operate with only a head. There are many parts of the body, and we have our own roles within the body. But we're called to be faithful to God, to seek to have our minds, to seek to discern his will, so that we can walk with him and play our part in the life of the church. And we remember that he is with us always in all that we do. If Peter can be brought up from a humble fisherman to lead the church, we too can do great things for the church. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.